Hi, beautiful people. Welcome to the Fort Salem Library, where we read you your fanfiction. So sit down or don't, relax or don't, and enjoy these stories in a way you have not before. We at Fort Salem Library do not own Motherland Fort Salem or any of the related characters. The Motherland Fort Salem series is created by Elliot Lawrence and owned by Freeform. This story is a work of fanfiction and is meant for entertainment only. We are not making any profit from these stories. All rights of the original Motherland Fort Salem story belong to Freeform. We also do not own All Secrets Keep or any of its original characters and storylines. We did, however, get permission from the author to read their story. This story was created and written by Lisbeth_1, and you can find the link in our show notes. This story is being read to you by Celine.
All Secrets Keep, Chapter 14. General Alder, how long have you been alive? General Alder, were you ever actually dead? General Alder, why have you decided to reveal yourself now? What has changed? The press room was lost in the pandemonium of camera flashes and shouting reporters, all clamoring to be heard over one another. Telly watched in awe as Sarah, saying nothing, raised a hand, plunging the entire room into silence. Even the room she was in, full of excited and shocked War College students, immediately fell quiet at the gesture of the former general, even though it hadn't been for them. Telly felt a tugging on her hand that was grasping Rael's, and she reluctantly tore her eyes away from Sarah to look at her sisters. Rael's blue eyes were staring at Telly, curious, yet cautious. "Hey, you okay?" "Yeah," Telly breathed out. "Why wouldn't I be?" That had been the wrong thing to say. Rael's eyebrows furrowed. "Why wouldn't you be?" she echoed. "Telly, Alder is alive. I thought you would be more affected by this." Telly hesitated. Rael and Abigail, everyone, knew that Sarah was alive now. It couldn't hurt to tell them that she had already known, could it? "Tell," Rael said, more insistently, shaking her hand to bring Telly's attention out of her thoughts and back to her. "I need to tell you something." Telly turned her head back to Abigail. "Both of you." She stood, not letting go of her sister's hands as she dragged them off the couch with her. Abigail immediately began to protest as Telly dragged them both through the room with her. "Telly, what the hell? I want to watch this." "This is important, Abs." Telly tightened her grip on Abigail's hand to prevent her from breaking away and running back to watch the press conference. She pulled them both into the nearest empty room. It wasn't hard to find one with practically everyone stuffed into the common room, and slammed the door shut, leaning back against it as she did so. "Telly, what the hell is going on?" Rael demanded. "Why aren't you more surprised that Alder is alive? I thought you'd be shocked, relieved, or sad, or something, but you barely reacted when she appeared on TV. It's like you already knew or something." Telly swallowed nervously, eyes flitting back and forth between her sisters, who were both staring at her. "About that." A look of indescribable disbelief crossed Abigail's face. "No," she said slowly. Telly just stared at her. She knew her guilt was most likely written all over her face. She never was good at hiding her emotions. "No," Abigail said more forcefully. "Wait, did you know? For real?" Rael asked. She had been the one to accuse Telly in the first place, but she hadn't actually expected an affirmative answer. "I can't explain." "Telly, what the fuck?" Abigail shouted. "How did you know that? Who told you?" "Why didn't you tell us, Telly?" Rael's blue eyes held a bit of confusion, of hurt, and that was somehow more painful than Abigail's anger. "I can't explain," Telly repeated. "I couldn't tell you guys. It was like a literal military secret." She was desperate for her sisters to understand why she didn't tell them. If the Camarilla had found out that she was alive, they would have just attacked Fort Salem again to make sure they killed her for real. Petra wanted to keep her a secret, not only for her safety, but so the Camarilla would be unprepared for when she came back to fight them. Her words were coming out fast, desperate, as she looked pleadingly at her two sisters. Rael sighed. I guess that makes sense. But how did you know? Abigail pressed. She still looked a little angry, but not as much as she had moments before. You guys remember that day of that really bad storm when I thought I saw Alder and took off running? Tally was careful to call her Alder and not Sarah in front of her sisters. She did want to tell them about her and Sarah at some point, but definitely not until after they calmed down and realized why she didn't tell them Sarah was alive. Yeah, of course, Rael shrugged. Well, it was Alder. Adil taught her that invisibility working and... Adil knew she was alive too? Angry Abigail was back. Shit. Tally hadn't intended to get Adil in trouble. Yes, I will come back to that. Damn right we will, Abigail grumbled. Abs, let her talk. Rael gently smacked her on the shoulder. Tally gave Rael a grateful look. Anyway, as I was saying, it was Alder, and she ended up seeing the whole thing and how bad I was taking her death, and she felt bad that I blamed myself. So she asked Petra to let her see me. Where has she been all this time? Abigail's anger seemed to have dissipated into curiosity now. In a safe house, under Fort Salem. It's actually... Tally bit her lip. That's actually where I've been going every day after lunch, to visit Sarah. Both Abigail and Rael's eyebrows flew up. Wait, I'm sorry, she's Sarah now? Abigail asked. Tally felt the blood drain from her face as she realized her slip-up. Wait, Rael said breathlessly. She was staring at Tally with an incredulous look on her face. Is Alder your secret girlfriend? Don't be ridiculous, shitbird. Abigail rolled her eyes. There obviously is no secret girlfriend. Her gaze landed on Tally's face, eyes wide and looking guilty, and her jaw dropped. Holy shit. Alder is your secret girlfriend? Keep it down, Tally said, panicked, finally stepping away from the door. She felt a furious blush rise on her face as she did so, both her sisters staring at her in shock. Oh my goddess, she is, isn't she? Rael was still breathless, like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. Tally couldn't blame her. Yes, Tally squeaked out. Abigail was staring at Tally like she had grown a second head. Is it serious? Rael's voice had taken on a gentler tone. Do you love her? Tally felt her heart flutter in her chest at that, and she was unable to stop the smile that appeared on her face. Yeah, I do. A lot. Do you know if she feels the same? Tally bit her lip and looked down at her feet as she recalled the emotions that had flooded through the bond from Sarah earlier that morning. Emotions strong enough to force their way through a bond that had, up until that moment, only gone one way. She remembered the gentle way that Sarah had washed her hair, had held her, had kissed her goodbye. She remembered the soft smiles that had only ever been directed at her, and the way Sarah's voice sounded when she said, "I love you." Yes, she looked back up at her sisters. She does. Rael took a deep breath. Well, she said with a shrug, that's really all that matters, isn't it? Tally let out a gasp, somewhere between a laugh and a sob. Really? Do you mean that? Wait, you're okay with this? Abigail asked incredulously. Like, you don't find this weird at all? Tally froze, turning to look at Abigail. Of course it's weird, Abs, but I'm not exactly one to judge on who you fall in love with, Rael said pointedly. And besides, if Alder loves her back, then yeah, I'm okay with it. Abs. Telly hated how her voice cracked when she said her sister's name, but the approval of her relationship with Sarah by her sisters was something she desperately needed. I know this has to be weird for you, but please, I love her, and you're my sister. I can't do this without you being okay with it. She choked on her last words, tears blurring her vision. Abigail stared at Telly for a moment, until her shoulders slumped, and she threw her hands up in defeat. All I'm saying is she better not break your heart. I mean, I'll fight her if I have to, but I don't really like my chances. Telly let out a sob of relief and threw herself at Abigail. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Abigail caught her with a small grunt, squeezing her tight. Yeah, whatever. You're welcome. She grumbled her words, but a small smile grew on her face anyway. They both felt Raelle join in on the hug, wrapping her arms around the both of them as best she could. I love you guys. Telly's voice was muffled from where she was squished between the two girls. We love you too, Tal. The three girls stood there for a moment, content in each other's arms, until Abigail spoke up again, demanding, Now what the hell is this about Adil knowing Alder was alive? President Wade arrived the next day. The motorcade arrived early in the morning and stayed until late in the evening. It was a Saturday, so there were no classes, and students spent the day trading rumors and spreading gossip, both about why Wade was there and about Alder's return. It took everything Telly had in her to not snap at students who would pass by, loudly trading rumors and theories as to where Alder had been and what would happen to her now. Lots of students seemed to think that Wade was here to force Alder into retirement, to make sure she had no more influence in the army, even with Petra as general. Others seemed to think that Wade was there to discuss and sign an official declaration of war against the Camarilla, now that Alder was back, and some were under the impression that Wade was simply angry with Petra for keeping the secret from her as well. Whatever the real reason for Wade's presence on campus was, Telly didn't know. She had snuck by Petra's office around noon, standing outside for as long as she dared, just to confirm that Sarah was indeed inside with Petra and Wade, and she was. She could hear muffled voices coming from inside, could hear Sarah's distinct authoritative tone, feel her presence through their link. It felt strange to not be able to go to the safe house and see Sarah that day. It felt even stranger to know that it was something that she would never be able to do again. It was something that Telly had done every day for the past 2.5 months, and to suddenly have to stop, with no idea when she would actually be able to see Sarah again. It was hard. Harder than when Telly had first been unbiddied and had constantly craved Alder's presence. This was something else entirely, and as the days bled on, and Sarah seemed to be constantly caught up in meeting with the other generals and politicians that stopped by to visit, Telly found herself becoming more and more miserable. And if she were being honest with herself, she was scared. She hadn't really considered what a relationship with Sarah would be like once Sarah had to go back to being a general. Caught up in the bliss of getting to spend alone time with Sarah every day for almost a month, as they explored their new relationship, hadn't prepared her for what it would be like when they suddenly couldn't see each other for days on end. She couldn't help but wonder how Sarah was feeling as the days dragged on. Did she have time to think about Telly? Was she missing her as much as Telly missed her? Would she even want to continue the relationship she had with Telly now that she was once again her superior officer? That possibility was what scared Telly the most. In the first few days that passed, Telly's unit mates had teased her relentlessly about their relationship with Sarah. Despite their earlier reservations, they seemed to quickly overcome the awkwardness of it, and would constantly ask Telly questions about what she was like as just Sarah, and not the general. After first finding out, it had taken Abigail all but an hour to once again spot the hickeys on Telly's neck and, with a shriek of mortified laughter, proclaim it was more about the general than she ever needed to know, but it didn't stop her from asking questions with a morbid curiosity. As the days dragged on, however, and it had become almost a week since Tally had seen Sarah last, the teasing from her sisters had almost ceased to exist. It was as if they sensed her inner turmoil, her distress and worry about what the future held for her relationship with Sarah. It wasn't until lunch one day, Tally picking at her food more than actually eating it, Raelle and Abigail next to her discussing the upcoming Christmas ball at the end of December, that Tally felt her again. Her head jerked up to look at the entrance of the mess hall, and, sure enough, Sarah had walked in, talking to Anacostia. She seemed to sense Tally as well, whether through their connection or simply just feeling Tally stare at her. But Sarah looked over Anacostia's shoulder, and their eyes met. Tally, despite all her worries, felt her breath catch in her throat, and a smile split over her face at the sight of Sarah, some of the tension in her chest easing, making it easier to breathe. Sarah's face softened slightly as she saw Tally looking at her, and she smiled softly back at Tally for a split second, before she looked away again, face slipping back into the mask of General Alder. "What is she doing here?" Abigail's tone wasn't accusatory, but rather curious as she watched Sarah and Anacostia. Tally couldn't tear her gaze away from Sarah. "She has to eat now, remember?" She felt Abigail kick her under the table. "Close your mouth, Tal." Tally looked away from Sarah with a flush, but she was still acutely aware of her presence just across the room. "Am I being obvious?" "That you're pining for Alder?" Raelle hid her smile behind her cup. "Yeah, but to be fair, it's not really any different than how you looked at her before." Abigail snickered into her plate. "She's got a point. Your hero worship thing was always pretty obvious." "It wasn't a hero worship thing," Tally said defensively. "Okay, you're crushed then," Raelle retorted. "Is that better?" "You're both assholes," Tally grumbled, but she knew they were telling the truth. She had always been a little starstruck at first when it came to being around Sarah, but that had quickly developed into admiration, and then further beyond, into love, when she had actually gotten to know the woman. Abigail and Raelle just scoffed and rolled their eyes good-naturedly, going back to their discussion about the Christmas ball. Tally tuned them out, letting the bond lead her and turning her head to locate Sarah again. She was sitting down with Anacostia, the two women having an entire table to themselves, the lower-ranking soldiers too scared to even sit at the same table as General Alder. Tally felt her heart jump into her throat as she realized Sarah was already looking at her again. She bit her lip, doing her best to hold back the goofy smile she knew was threatening to take over her face as she met Sarah's electric blue gaze. The tips of her ears burned. Sarah simply smiled softly again before turning away, answering whatever question Anacostia had posed to her. Over the course of her unit finishing lunch, Tally kept throwing glances over her shoulder, desperate for any sort of contact with Sarah, but Sarah hadn't looked back at her. She didn't catch Sarah's gaze again until she was leaving the mess hall, and she felt a pang of disappointment in her chest at the frown on Sarah's face when she left the room. The three of them hadn't taken more than a few steps down the hallway when a voice sounded behind them. "Cadet Craven!" The three of them spun around, Tally whirling around so quickly that her medal bounced against her chest. Her heart was hammering in her chest as she took in Sarah, standing directly behind them, hands clasped behind her back. "General Alder." Sarah's title felt weird in her mouth. "May I speak with you for a moment?" Sarah's voice was even, but her eyes never left Tally's. Tally nodded breathlessly, and for a second nobody moved until Sarah finally tore her gaze away from Tally to flit her eyes to Raelle and Abigail. "Alone," she said pointedly. "She's all yours, ma'am," Abigail said with a smirk, taking Raelle by the arm, and the two of them walked away, leaving Tally alone with Sarah for the first time in almost a week. Without even thinking, Tally took a step forward, but then stopped herself, remembering where they were. Her heart ached with Sarah so close, but so out of reach. "Come with me," Sarah said softly, beckoning with her head. Tally's legs immediately obeyed, following Sarah down the hallway a bit, until Sarah stopped and opened a door that led to a private dining room, and stepped aside, letting Tally enter first. Tally entered the room feeling almost nervous. Sarah clicked the door shut behind them, and before Tally could even react, Sarah stepped forward and grabbed Tally's face with both of her hands, claiming Tally's mouth with her own. Tally whimpered into Sarah's touch, hands shooting out and grabbing at Sarah, curling into her jacket, and trying to pull her closer as she kissed Sarah greedily back. Sarah's touch was electric, Tally's every nerve feeling like it was on fire as Sarah moved her hands from Tally's face, one dropping to her waist, the other one tangling in her hair. Tally felt herself go weak in the knees as Sarah entered her mouth with a swipe of her tongue, exploring. The kiss ended almost as quickly as it started, Sarah abruptly pulling back with a gasp, her eyes still closed. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her hand disentangling itself from Tally's hair to drop down and rest on the other side of her waist. "I couldn't help myself." Tally shook her head, still clinging to Sarah tightly. "Please don't apologize. I've missed you so much." Sarah's eyes opened, a touch of pain behind them. "I've missed you too," she admitted, "more than you know." Tally couldn't help the tears that sprang to her eyes at Sarah's admission, and Sarah's grip on her tightened, pulling her in to wrap her arms around Tally properly. "I'm sorry I couldn't see you sooner," she whispered into Tally's hair. "The repercussions of Petra keeping me a secret seem to be endless. Wade and all of our allies at The Hague are angry with us for not trusting them with the information." Tally didn't trust herself not to cry if she spoke, so she just clung to Sarah, breathing in her familiar, comforting scent. Sarah held her for a moment, softly stroking her back, until she loosened her grip, stepping back just enough so she could look Tally in the eye. "What's wrong?" Her voice was soft, concerned. "You're worried about something. I can feel it." Tally began uncertainly. How was she supposed to tell Sarah that she was terrified, that Sarah was going to leave her, that she would decide that a relationship with a cadet wasn't worth it and walk away? She looked away from Sarah's intense gaze, blinking back tears. "Tally, look at me, my love. What's the matter?" Tally squeezed her eyes shut, the term of endearment making her throat close up, but she turned back to Sarah. "I'm scared," she whispered, opening her eyes to once again look at Sarah. Sarah's grip on her tightened, and she looked confused. "Scared of what?" Her voice was gentle. "I didn't know," Tally swallowed thickly. "I thought that maybe things might change between us." Sarah froze. "How do you mean?" she asked carefully. It became too hard to hold Sarah's gaze, so Tally dropped her eyes to her hands, where they were currently resting on Sarah's hips. "I thought that you might change your mind," she said softly. Sarah didn't move. "I thought that maybe, since you were general again, my superior officer, that you wouldn't want to stay with me." Tally's heartbeat was thrumming in her ears. "That you wouldn't have enough time, or it wouldn't be a good idea." Sarah took a shaky breath. "Tally, listen to me very carefully." Tally nodded, still not looking at Sarah. Will you look at me, please?" Sarah's tone became almost pleading. Tally forced her head up to look at Sarah, and her heart broke when she saw tears in Sarah's eyes. "I love you," Sarah said forcefully, squeezing Tally's waist as she spoke, "no matter if I am a general or not. I love you, Tally Craven. Nothing will change that. Do you hear me?" Tally let out a sob, nodding desperately, and Sarah reached up to wipe her tears away, pressing a kiss to her forehead. She held Telly gently, like that for a moment, before straightening, brushing some of Telly's hair behind her ear. "You know," Sarah said slowly, "I had been wondering the same thing this week. About you." Telly blinked her tears away, confused. "What?" Sarah continued stroking her hair. "You fell in love with me as Sarah. Now that I am once again General, I don't know how often I can be your Sarah. There will be times where we are near each other, and I will have to be your General." Her hand stilled in Telly's hair. "That is something I am okay with, but I wasn't sure if you would be. I am..." Sarah looked away uncomfortable, almost nervous. "Intimately aware of the fact that you do not always approve of my actions as General. I was not sure if that fact would influence your decision to be with me or not." "No," Telly said forcefully, immediately. "I lost you once, Sarah. I won't do it again. I want this. I want you, in any way that I can have you." The thought of Sarah thinking that Telly didn't want to be with her was ridiculous to Telly. How could you possibly want to be with anyone else? Sarah smiled softly at her, sighing as she rested her forehead against Telly's. "Then you shall have me. All of me."
Please find the fanfiction you just listened to on Archive of Our Own and leave the author some love. Without them, this wouldn't be possible, and we want to thank them from the bottoms of our hearts for creating these amazing stories and keeping the show alive.